Greetings. It was about 5 years ago that I found myself at this wonderful forum organized by extremely passionate people and who had impeccable organization. At that point of time, when I spoke, there were three other speakers. There was Cor van Gelderen from Netherlands, a fourth-generation nursery owner who spoke of plants as if they were friends and family. There was Zhao Yingzi from China, who spoke in faltering English, but nonetheless managed to communicate the beautiful gardens that she'd done in China. But she also spoke about the trade from that land into Europe and America, and how perhaps the porcelain trade was more responsible for the profusion of the Chinese landscapes across the globe. And then, of course, there was Andrew Wilson, who did and spoke about his wonderfully abstract and conceptual show gardens that he had been doing both in England and Singapore. Our talk at that point of time was called Mending Apparatuses, Gardens of the Future Past. In the preceding few years, we had spoken to friends and colleagues and peers and students across the country and asked them to send us examples of what they would consider an Indian garden. All this had led to us making a small monograph and an exhibition that we called Tracing Narratives, Indian Landscape Design. This was an exhibition that traveled across the country. While the exhibition talked about many projects, what it also tried to do was to define what a garden meant, at least for us. Some aspects of this conversation even then became quite clear. The garden was a space that had a circumscribed territory. So it didn't matter whether the space was immediately finite or at times extremely a larger borrowed idea of landscape. But what was important in that space was that there was a certain act, a certain ritual that had to be enacted that connected the user with many ideas of nature. This was very important. It didn't matter whether it had plants or it didn't have plants. Often it could be a piece of sheetrock, but nonetheless, it was a garden. The other thing that we had said then was that the garden was a unique mental construct. And at some level, a garden could be thought of as a set of lenses through which we could begin to evaluate ourselves or our relationship with the world. And lastly, we had ruled the fact that the garden, while it was an important cultural, social, and artistic construct, was something that we are beginning to ignore or not treat it or not lend it the dignity that it should be lent with. We had used many examples at that point of time, and I quickly refer to two. One of them is of the Commonwealth Cemetery Garden. There are gardens of this kind across the globe wherever the British fought a war. But in this town, which is my town close to Mumbai, these gardens are immaculate. They're precise in the way that they are maintained. The edges of the grass always perfect. And when you look at this perfection, this neat symmetry, this deep care for maintenance, and you contrast that within what is the Indian urbanity, the garden becomes an outlier. It becomes a lens through which to try and understand the mess that we are surrounded with. Another garden that we had talked about was a garden done in Punjab when the capital city was being constructed and designed by Le Corbusier. There was at that point of time an engineer in the PWD called Nekchand, and perhaps confounded by this new urbanity that was being thrown at him, he revolted. And he took the broken pieces of the discarded city, he took the debris that came out of construction and built an alternative city of animals and men and figurines strewn over large parts of area. It was his idea of protesting against the kind of urbanity that perhaps was being foisted upon the country at that point of time. Those were very, very different times. Those were times when we had the luxury and the liberty to engage in esoteric pursuits or whatever that came to our mind. The times today are extremely different. In these times, and in the last 1 year, all of us have often discussed what these times mean to us. And there have been a set of conversations a set of writings, a set of thoughts that have found a certain kind of currency and have become important for us. And it is these conversations that have taken on a sense of urgency, but even a sense of greater relevance. One of the terms that we've come across is a term that's called Thulucene. This is a term that was introduced to us by this wonderful, witty writer of gardens living in Provence, Louisa Jones, and she told us about this one term. What it really does is that it urges us to examine the links between the human and the non-human. It encourages relationships between the animate and the inanimate. And it forces us to expand ideas of kinship or better, and it forces us to talk about better ideas of deep absorption in whatever we do. This term, of course, is from a book called Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Thulucene, written by Donna Haraway. Donna Haraway's other work, which is more famous, is an essay that's called the Cyborg Manifesto. And that essay rejected the boundaries between man and animal and equally rejected the boundaries between man and machine. So what she is trying to propose, and which strikes a chord today, is that there is a need to establish new relationships with the world, whether it's animate or inanimate. She further, of course, went on to say in that book that it is not the Anthropocene that is responsible for this perceptible shift from nature. It's the Capitalocene and its greed for money, and hence recommends the beginning of a new era that she calls the Thulucene. The other book that, of course, is an old book, which is Walden by Henry Thoreau. And this book talks about wilderness. It talks about the profound teachings that wilderness can bring to us. And it sort of puts our life in a certain kind of perspective. It talks about wilderness being a space that we can engage with completely, and we are coded to thrive in it. These spaces can be mentors and they can be friends. When you take that idea of the wilderness, and by just a slight extension of the imagination, the garden comes to the mind. The garden is a place that has the ability to heal, anchor our moments, and really it's a microcosm of the many realities that we live in. The other book that also struck a certain chord was the book by David Abraham, who's an ecologist and a philosopher. And in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, he talks about how we are tuned to build on and nurture relationships between nature and us, develop a sense of reciprocity. And he makes a strong case for us to revisit our relationships with these ideas and these spaces. In today's time, then, we are compelled to ask ourselves the question, what is the relevance of designers such as us? What is the role that we should now play in a world that has changed? And how have these times reshaped our entire world and our immediate society? When we came back to the office, much as everybody in the world was concerned about their sense of relevance, as were we decided to bring out a small in-house publication that, not so imaginatively, we called Design in the Times of COVID-19. This was really a book for us, for all of us working in the studio. And hence we chose to coin 5 phrases, 5 words, each one of them gateposts through which we could begin to focus our ideas of design, but also evaluate whether our design fell within these gateposts that we were trying to create for ourselves. These ideas really were scale, forge, audit, masks, and sight. Scale, acknowledge the need to be even closer to land and nature. It stood for space conservation and land engagement. Forge, which stood for recreation, gratification, and exhilaration, was really about whether spaces must now become repositories of timeless conversations, whether there should be vessels of stories, whether the idea of recreation itself should be examined. Audit, particularly for a country that is as dense as India, was talking about city planning and its management and ideas of urbanity. Masks was about making social communities and spaces. We do know that in the last 1 year, Our very idea of community has changed. Community now is remote, it's digital, we haven't met each other physically, but nonetheless, there has been a strong idea of community that has been forged. And perhaps as designers, we need to respond to these new ideas of community. And the last one was sight, simplicity in treatment and execution. This one really wanted us to reassess our ideas of opulence, our ideas of luxury, and our ideas of comfort. While doing this book, this small monograph, we also looked at some of the work that we had done in the preceding few years to see whether the work in some ways responded to these gateposts that we were trying to create for ourselves. Let me quickly share two projects for your benefit. The first one is actually a regular office building. This is built in a town not very far from where we work. This is a town of artists. It's got one of India's oldest art schools. The owner is a patron of arts. And so we looked at an old painting, a 1929 painting of Paul Klee called Uncomposed Objects in Space. And we looked at the stillness and yet the tension in the painting and wanted to recreate that idea in the atrium of the building, an open to sky atrium, which has got boxes suspended in the air with stillness, and yet this tension that looked as if it would implode at any given time. The wall, the facade of the painting was something that was inscribed by the artist Walter de Souza, who came and has studied from this town as an art student. And he made the connections with the name of the city. The city is called Vadodara. Word means the banyan tree, the city of banyan trees. And while the construction process was happening, he did a watermark of the banyan tree on the facade of the building. Other parts of the building, the atrium back hall, has a metal screen that's been designed by him, which has got the seed of life that is embossed within the metal. It becomes a stage very often for performances. The basements, which are actually parking basements, are built with great love and attention to be a forest of columnar trees. In this basement, while cars are not parked, very often it's used for concerts, it's used for lectures, it's used for exhibitions. The office itself of the patron, we imagined as an art gallery. And while it displayed all the art that he has collected, it also has installations such as the one on the right, which is done by an artist called Brugain, which really talks about the river in his city and the manner in which it has had to face many ideas of changing urbanity. None of these ideas were actually sort of ideas that were asked for while we were designing the building. What we were asked for was to design a regular office buildings. These ideas came about because of a set of conversations that we'd had with the clients. And it is exactly these ideas that were visited during the time of COVID. People working in these offices who were locked up in their homes came to the building just to spend a little time and sit in the atrium and look at the suspended boxes. Or they walked in the empty offices and they looked at the art. Or even more gratifyingly, the patron used the open atrium to invite some of the oldest artists of this city and have a meal with them. What it taught us very clearly is that very often projects need to be infused with ideas of art, with ideas of conceptual clarity that perhaps are not demanded by the project itself. It is for this reason that this project became important to us. The other was a project that we'd done many years back, 21 years back. We had gone to a barren piece of land. There were 2 mango trees on this barren piece of land, and the client wanted a place to go to, a simple place to rest. Below the 2 mango trees, we decided to build a mud hut. The branches of the mango tree loomed low, and so the hut dipped down and sort of sunk into the ground. It's a simple composition. 2 mango trees, a hut, a small utility space next to it, all of it subscribed by a circle of wild grasses. This place became a place that the client went often during the last 12 months and sat and found peace and quiet in otherwise what was an extremely turbulent and disturbing world. Post this document, which we created, we said while we had created the gateposts of understanding, we asked ourselves that while the work that we'd done had got some value, or at least we were beginning to see some value in it, it wasn't entirely clear to us whether these values were something that had been sort of imbibed into the work because of a very clear consciousness. And we then slowly started deciding and deciphering that perhaps these values get embedded in this work because just about the way that we work, just about the way that we look at the idea of work. And this led us to make another small document where we tried to sort of decipher the reasons that this kind of work gets created. And it led us to three very, very simple words: process, purpose, and participation. They're not very difficult words, but nonetheless, they're nuanced words and it needs to be discussed a little bit. So the idea of process for us is to relentlessly ask questions, to continuously ask questions, sometimes without a clear purpose, but such that each idea, each minuscule nature of idea is examined in a way in which to extract new meanings, new values, and that we would not rest till a multi-layered web was created of many ideas floating in this web. We had done a small monograph about a project that I will share with you later. And in that monograph, we tried to explain this idea of process, or we said, why process? And what we said in it is that while dealing with the immediate requirements of a project and leading up to it is process, the real process starts after this has been accomplished. And we have written that the processes that matter and are engaging take this basic requirements as the bare minimum. Then they add and hence examine ideas of life and culture. They strive to find ways of developing conversations that engage the individual, but at the same time hope to engage with history and our changing notions of life. Good processes work with many notions of time: the immediate, the archaeological, the past, the present, and the future. The other thing that we talked about was purpose. Much less as all of you across the world, we spend the first 2 months from our homes, logging onto the computer every day in the morning and working the full day. And we would wake up the next day and get back to it, a certain kind of joy, a certain kind of enthusiasm to get back to work. Slowly, the lockdown ended, and many of us petered back into the office. First, a few of them, and then a few more came. But that didn't change the mood. Every day we came to work with a sense of purpose. Uh, as everywhere else in the world, projects were being stalled, some of them were being cancelled. There was the issue of economics, but nonetheless, the idea of purpose stayed true. And we wondered, why did this happen? And to us, there's a word in Urdu that perhaps defines it, and that word is called riyaz. Riyaz means practice, but it also means a crazy sense of dedication. It's a word that's used usually by musicians when they practice their music, but it's also a word that's linked with the idea of spirituality and Sufism. It refers to these swirling dervishes who dance in a meditative trance. It's almost active meditation, physically active meditation, much like design is. It's physically active meditation. It is precise and it's focused. It's also interesting to note that the word riyaz also means the garden of purity. Where does this come from? Where does the sense of purpose come from? We really don't know. It seems almost like an ethic that has been sort of instilled in all of us, and perhaps it has something to do with the fact that this has been generations in work. The studio has benefited from the past generations, and we've took from every year, every decade, values that are transferred to the subsequent younger people who come to the studio. The third word, of course, is participation. We are a fairly non-hierarchical studio. We work from two places, Ahmedabad and Mumbai, and there are about 45, 50 of us. And we have no serious hierarchy in the firm. A young trainee has got as much voice as somebody who's been in the studio working as a designer for maybe a decade or sometimes even more. There are no designations. We work with a single mail ID. All the mail, whether it's about work, whether it's about taxation, all of it comes to one sort of ID. And to a certain extent, this transparency encourages meaningful participation. There's nothing opaque, there's nothing screened. And more than that, it allows a life that is open and weightless. It's this belief that we have in engaging with in conversations or to expand thoughts. We see it as a responsibility. It's not an option in the studio. And it is these conversations that keep us grounded, keep us nimble, and allow us at ultimately better response to surroundings. So with these sets of ideas, with scale, forge, audit, mask, site, and on the other hand, what leads to them, which is process, purpose, and participation, we've decided today to put together a bunch of projects that we think refer to these ideas and might help us to navigate through these times. The first is a city. It's a new city that we are building. India will become urban. There is absolutely no doubt that over the next 20 or 30 years, the majority of India, which is a rural country, will start living in some form of urban matrix. This, of course, leads to immense issues of urban development and on housing. The Indian urbanity is not very well expressed. You can begin to see huge differences living cheek by jowl, socioeconomic differences, differences of job opportunities. The Indian public arena is also not well developed. The roads are not particularly well imagined, the traffic not well imagined, and simple things like just going out every day to buy vegetables or buy a food can be an arduous task. In that context, we have been working on now for the last 9 years, but this has now been expressed a little better. The work has been expressed a little better just in the last 4 or 5 years on a city that is 16% the land mass of Dublin. But upon its completion, it will have 10 times the population of Dublin. So it's a densely packed city. That's the master plan for the city, and that's a master plan for about the 1,000 acres of the city. While drawing up the master plan, we trekked this entire 1,000 acres and mapped all the rocks, all the soils, all the grasses that grew, all the trees, the water lines and the swales, the lakes, and conserved as much as is possible given the nature of density that was going to be expressed. We've never done a city before. And so it led us to do all kinds of studies about things about how does one light up a city, or how does one do play spaces in a city, or what is the idea of art in a city, or what are the urban design guidelines for the city. Simple things which are commonplace anywhere in the world were new to us. Things like how do you build good roads, or what kind of curbing system is required to build good roads. Did we have manufacturers? We didn't. And so we had to develop somebody to start manufacturing for the roads and design good quality roads for this city. Some images of these roads, and then the high life or the high street life or the retail life along these roads, the street furniture, whether it was benches, whether it was bus stands, whether it was a signage, simple things like street crossings, the plazas. This one, of course, is a small plaza that's next to a temple, which is used by the elders and the children of the city who come there quite often in the evenings. And over time, the city has begun to express itself. We also worked on the housing courtyards. These are very, very tight housing courtyards with tall buildings on both the sides, but nonetheless to lend it with a sense of dignity, a sense of art even, and become a place for the community to come down in the evenings. The public park, this is an aerial shot of a small park between two large play spaces. On one side is the tennis courts, and the other side an Olympics pool. So it's a connecting part. But even in this little connecting part, to bring in the idea of art by the manner in which these benches are done, or the lakeside park. So this is a Coney wetland park. There's a wetland that we managed to preserve. And on the edge of the wetland, we built this park, which has got absolutely no civil work. And it's got these lovely paths. It's got indigenous flora. It's got floral displays that talk about plants for scent, plants for medicine, edible plants. And it also creates markers, almost like forest markers in the wilderness, which become reference points at one or two locations in the park. And it creates places, as is this one, as a place for meditation or a place to read a book or just to look at the birds. And it's a park that's used greatly by the elders of the city. In this park, we've also located a nature interpretation center, which is almost built, but not completed because of the last 1 year. This is a building that's built out of rammed earth and bamboo. And the halls of this building will have an exhibit, a participatory, interactive exhibit that talks about nature and ecology, which the children of the city can come and learn from. In the same city, which is Mumbai, in another part of the city, we had the opportunity to design a public park. Mumbai, as you all know, at some point of time used to be called the Manchester of India. This is where the textile mills of the city were. But a big labor strike has felled those textile mills. And bit by bit, all that land is what the new Mumbai, the new city is beginning to take over to build their new houses, their new offices. In that, there's a thin strip of land which became what we call the linear park. We have believed, and as I've said before, that gardens or parks or landscape design, beyond looking at the idea of ecology or plant material, must also become or take the responsibility of become storytellers. It's important that these spaces can connect us back to our culture, to our history, sometimes to ecological narratives that we've forgotten. Today, we find more and more, given the nature of the way that cities are done or imagined, or the way that our life is, we tend to forget what our cities were all about. In this thin strip, we decide to tell the story of Mumbai. We talk about the textile mills and its connection. We talk about the fact that the city actually has been made out of 7 islands, which were landfilled, and that's how Mumbai came to be. We talk about the Oval Maidan, which is a remnant of the Britishers, but these large Maidans are really lungs of the city. We talk about the Sanjay National Gandhi Park, which is a very large park that sits on one edge of the city, but it's a park that the people of the city don't go to. We talk about the Hanging Gardens, which really is a garden at an elevated level. And because underneath this garden is a large water reservoir that distributes water to that part of the city, and hence Hanging Gardens, hence elevated. We talk about Marine Drive, which is an extremely important public space that sits on as a crescent on the sea. It's also called the Queen's Necklace. As you can see in this image, the long sliver of the park along a busy road. It begins by these chimneys that are sort of reconstructed out of metal foil. The floor of the park has been done in concrete and machine parts, almost as if you're walking on the graveyard of the textile mills. A picture here of an elevated deck. The trees are growing now. This is a slightly older picture, but once they're grown, this will be reminiscent of the Hanging Gardens. And then a plaza that when you look at it from the top, it reminds you of the containers in the shipping container yard. To make the connection of Bombay and its maritime trade. In front, you can begin to see some quadrants, each quadrant representing one of the 7 islands that got filled to make Bombay. At the back there, old world nostalgic swings to reconnect us to the idea of childhood. The image of the 7 islands and the benches that were designed like little boats from where you could go from one island to the other. Some another part of the project, other benches, and these benches really designed much as if you were on a ferry in the sea. And as you change the direction, the back of the bench could tilt and sway so that you could look and orient yourself to where you were going, to keep creating references that made connections continuously to this historical tale and this cultural tale that we were trying to infuse this park with. A last picture looking at the main plaza from the top. Having said this, the idea of parks is not very well expressed. India is a very, very dense country. There are limited resources. There is not so much money that goes into creating public spaces. In all cities, and our city or where I come from is not particularly different. It's a large city with many parks, 300-400 parks. But if you actually went to these parks, you would begin to see that the parks are dilapidated, they're poorly maintained, they're not fenced off well. The children equipment, the play equipment is very often broken. They're swept very often. We decided to do something about this whole idea and created an initiative which a patron supports along with the municipal authorities of the city. And a group of us got together to look at the idea of parks in our city. We started creating a replicable set of toolkits. uh, ideas that could be repeated in many parks, not just in the city, but across in different parts of the country. The whole idea was to really do it in a manner in which it was extremely economical, it did not require too much of maintenance, and it was easy to do. We looked at ideas of signage, for example. What is a sensible way of just looking at signage that is slightly artistic but nonetheless clear? We look at the idea of allowing universal access to aged people, to everybody who could enter and sort of access these parks. We looked at the idea of water. Each and every park, it didn't matter how big or small they were. Some of them were really, really small parks, they're barely 500 square meters. But in all these parks, the idea of water harvesting, water recharge, water conservation became a very, very important idea. The idea of simple street furniture, benches that was maintainable, that could sort of deal with vandalism if that were to occur, and that had a certain sort of aesthetics attached to it. The idea of planting so that it both planted for biodiversity, but also looked at native or indigenous flora and looked at the way that planting could express itself in different seasons. Simple things like waste bins, for example. What kind of waste bin for a city like India, which was possible? It was hardy, it was durable, and it was easy to maintain. The idea of course, compost and collecting all the litters in all this park, this happens. And we have over a period of time finished now over the last 2 or 3 years, about 8 parks. There are images of 6 of them in front of you. As you can begin to see, these parks vary in size and scale. Some of them are very, very small, some of them slightly larger, a couple of acres. And they're in different socio-economic parts of the city, intentionally chosen so that we could begin to examine the diversity that they would allow. As you can see in all of them, while the shapes are different, or the sizes are different, or the sites are different, the kit of parts remains the same. Some images of the park. This is an aerial shot of the entrance of one of the park. This is another park which has got these long trellises done of construction steel and children's play area at the back. This park is in an area that is a particularly difficult area. It's a very, very dense area, and they have absolutely no place and no release in terms of open space. A very simple park with just bare earth in one part, simple play equipment, has become something that is greatly cherished by the people living in this area. Signage in one of the other parts, and I talked about universal access. The street furniture and the benches in the park in the other ones. Some images. And in some of the parks, along with the community, we've started being able to start creating urban forests, as this last one begins to show. This work continues. We are still in the process of finishing 2 large city level parks. One of them is a very old park. It's the Victoria Park in the city. It's more than 100 years old. And it's the first time that it will go under restoration. And both these parks should be ready in the next maybe 3 or 4 months. And the patron has been so gladdened by this initiative that we are now already in talks with the municipal commissioners in other parts of the country to see whether this idea could be seeded in their cities. The next one is actually an office landscape. This is for a corporate who's one of India's biggest corporate. They are in electricity, they are in power generation, they're in pharmaceutical. So it's a very, very large corporate house. Just before we started looking at the idea of landscape for this particular campus, we were lucky to go to Agra and see a garden that's called the Arambagh, or it's called the Arambagh or Rambagh. And this was a project that sits on the river. It's one of Babur's first gardens when he came to India. When you look at the model of the park, it's a simple set of quadrants, a simple set of walkways and sunken sort of garden spaces. Even today, if you were to visit it, it's not particularly a well-maintained garden. But nonetheless, as you start walking along these walkways, bit by bit, the mind starts playing tricks and you get lost in a mental labyrinth. And the only reference that you have really is the river that's yonder and the beautiful pavilions, if you were to see them through the foliage of the trees. You start relating to space, culture, and nature in very, very different ways. We decided to use this idea and in the setting that was presented to us, work with this set of axes, implying thereby that there was no one way to enter this park. This garden, you could pretty much enter it from wherever you wish to. The garden itself is divided into zones, separated by the set of axes. Right at the beginning, there's a recycled wood pavilion that the staff here uses for dining. There's a water body with islands, and those islands are only for birds. And over the last few years, we're beginning to see birds coming and using that for nesting. There's a museum of lost trees, or a court of lost trees, where we've gone around and found trees that, well, are extinct or not available very much now, and found them and planted one specimen in each of these courts. We grow our own food, and below where the parking basements are and above that, just in about 5 inches of soil, we've grown a grassland. For a corporate, normally given to ideas of opulence, to talk about landscape in a manner in which it connects us to ecology, it connects us to nature, and it sort of fosters a certain kind of empathy, uh, to us was an extremely gratifying experience. Some images. This is as you walk down on the left, you can begin to see the recycled wood pavilion, more landscape and planting along the way, benches that are suspended in the hedges, and then a little further down, benches where, as you can see, the flowers that are picked up every day in the morning and are put in these little containers to make joyous this whole act of coming to work every day. This sits at the edge of a large public fora, and that fora sort of descends down into water, which has got these islands. These islands, which are full of grasses, the trees have been planted and are now beginning to grow. One more sort of image of that. And on the edge, you can begin to see the early planting of the court of lost trees. The court of lost trees really, as I said, is a set of courts with a bench in each one of them. It's the walkway is made out of construction steel, and through the little openings, you can begin to enter the court and, well, sit down in the afternoon, have a cup of coffee, talk to people, but sit in the presence of a tree that one day, for sure, will become majestic. The courts where we grow food. And then finally, this thin soil grassland that we've grown on slabs, along with the benches that are there, which are along this sort of walkway where one can sit. The next is an industrial project. The client already had, it was an old factory, it's a pharmaceutical factory. He already had a running operation, and then he bought a piece of land, and he asked us to redesign or reimagine the entire master plan, build a set of buildings and reimagine the landscape. The one in the gray is the old, the one in the pink is the new land that he bought. And while we designed the buildings and while we did the landscape, what really was gratifying and worth sort of talking to all of you about was the manner in which the landscape expressed itself. This site has got extremely poor soil. It's black, it's loamy, it's got very low water recharge potential, there's a high pH, the fluoride content is very high. So even in a normal good soil, at least where we come from, if you can recharge 30,000 liters of water in a well and sort of connect it back to the aquifer per hour, in this site, you could barely do 13,000 liters an hour. So it was quite difficult. And this site, over a period of time, had gone below the highway level. There was no possible way in which the water could be drained out of the site. And we decided to use this as an opportunity. We divided the site into zones based on their catchments, based on the road networks. And in each zone, we located where the injection wells were going to be. Each injection well was going to take, whatever, 10, 12, 13,000 liters of water down to the aquifer. We did very, very meticulous calculations of rainfall, of peak flood hours, of the amount that each of this zone could deal with. And then, marked in the yellow, we excavated the soil from there and made them depressed valleys. And all the excavated soil, we then put in those zones which are marked in green, which then became the hill. So there was a balanced cut and fill on the site. It started creating, in our minds, a landscape of valleys and hills. And in the lowest point of the entire site, we located the administration building. We did it not as a bad joke, but really as a confidence of our calculations, our own belief in environmental engineering, and that if you work with nature well, then nature will not fail you. We'd work with the soil, improve the topsoil, started putting in small sort of percolation pipes at very short intervals so that the water could filter whatever water that sort of gathered in the valley. And then we work with geogrids and geotextiles to improve the porosity of the soil. This is, of course, the image of the entrance plaza. This is an image of the central part of the project where people come in the morning and stand in a moment of silence before they go to work. But what really gave us joy was this. This really became a landscape, as you can see, of gentle rolling hills and valleys planted with grasses and trees, which can deal with flooding for days on end. And in an industrial setting, to use the idea of water and to sculpt the land in a manner in which almost becomes land art became an idea that has become a very strong idea, not just for us, but the inmates or the workers or the management of this factory, and they're very proud of it. An image of the admin building, as you can see in one of the lower sort of parts of the contours. The building itself sits low, but all the workers straddle this building every day and they walk on top of it, almost to take charge of this world of work, and they go to their respective factories. And dissecting this building is the water that's held through the monsoon, creating a wonderful interplay between places of work and the idea of nature, something that they enjoy, they're very proud of, and are happy to show people around. One of the other things that we've also believed in the office for the longest time is that you cannot be a professional only by looking at the idea of practice, or only by practicing, or only by doing projects. The meaning of being a professional is to expand to the greatest and explore to the greatest every idea possible of that profession. To that end, for many years, we have something that's called LEAF, which is Landscape Environment and Advancement Foundation. And it's the research arm or the arm that does outreach work for the firm. Recently, just before COVID hit, we had started a fellowship program, and we'd given a fellowship to two young, wonderful, enthusiastic sets of landscape architects. And it is this work that came to its fruition during the fellowship. And in fact, in the middle of that time, we had a seminar to discuss this work, and I'd like to share that with you. The first was called Outgrow. This really talks about wild planting or nature planting. It's an idea that, of course, all of you know, is a well-established idea, and it's taking traction, taking ground in many parts of the world. But in India, it's an idea that's still not being talked about. To take this idea forward, these two young landscape architects, Dhara and a partner, Nishant, went around the countryside, spent days, weeks, months, just looking at plants that don't find a place in the nursery, don't find a place in our normal planting palette, and started collecting these plants just to begin to familiarize themselves. It was about making new friends, making new kinship, making new connections. And then they developed the process of observing these plants, identifying them, then finding ways of procuring them, and then take them to some place and allowing them to grow, and then begin to assess their growth patterns, their flowering seasons, and having learned then to translate that and take it into test sort of planting patches. They worked on this for almost a year and a half. They hired a place that was close to our office, close to our city. And this became a place that we went very often to just see this wonderful dance of the wild plants, and the manner in which they were jostling for attention, and the manner in which they were almost yearning or demanding that they soon be part of our world, a world that we had chosen to ignore for so long. Some images of this piece of land when they started planting, and the plants that they have identified over a period. This has then become a directory of plants. And finally, images of that same patch just before they had to give it away. It was a piece of place that they had on rent. I think they were broken to give it up, but nonetheless, this is how it looked around the time that this study came to an end. The other study was called Transgressing Wilderness. This was done by a professor, teacher in the local school, and also a landscape architect. And while there's a lot of work that's been done on talking about the ideas of wilderness, the ideas of the mental ideas of wilderness, there's very little work that talks about putting wilderness as a spatial construct. How does one, as a landscape architect, as a designer, a garden designer, imagine the idea of wilderness. What makes a place wild? It's not always the species. It's about the way things are arranged. It's about the way light is filtered. So she started looking at these many ideas of what really makes a place wild. She then went across many sites in the region and identified a set of sites. And she started studying them in great detail, doing sets of beautiful drawings, sections, sketches, photographs, memory maps, all of it leading to almost a manual of spatial constructs that try and communicate how ideas of wilderness may be created, how the idea of memory, how the idea of nostalgia, how it can be built into these spaces. I thought it was an extremely seminal piece of work, and I think it's a great tool for designers to go. The other project that we did is a very, very, very small project, and this is really the margin of a school building where the owner, a passionate young lady, wanted us to help her with the landscape. There really wasn't too much scope, but nonetheless, we decided to use this as a way of encouraging participation, a way of where the process really was more important than the outcome. We worked with the students for days on end. We did a model of the school. We invited the students to come and sort of put their idea of the garden in the margins. And from the many ideas that the students created, we really created a kit of parts, something that was green and nature, something that was game and activities, and something that was educational equipment. And all this led subsequently to how these compositions could be put together in the context of the school or the little margin that was available, leading finally to a plan. And as you can see, really the effort is on the left-hand side of the plan. The right-hand side of the plan are the open fields or the open grounds required for play. And it's in that little strip where all this drama and all this passion was poured. There were places for children to grow and look at their own plants. There was places for them to peer into mirrors that were built on the walls. There were floor games built into the driveways of the school. There were construction tubes and construction pipes put that became spaces of play. And the compound walls also started becoming outdoor blackboards where they would go and do their art classes or just go and draw during the lunch hour. Another project, something that we ended up working a great deal in the last 1 year, was a site that when we went, close by there was scrub, there were these wonderful sort of animals. And it was a difficult site. It was a large site. And we spent the first many, many weeks and months just drawing the site. It's almost that idea of riyaz, or almost that idea of meditative, active contemplation of a space. Here is a drawing that sort of maps the granularity of all the soil, or another one in this case that shows how the water flowed on the site and where did it rush faster and where did it gently go over the site, or just ideas of what grew on the site in terms of what was a little scrub, what was a wild grass, what was it, so on and so forth. And we drew all these ideas. And the first presentation that we did to the client was not really drawings of the project as much as it was these images of man's connection with nature, man's connection under the sky, man's connection with the changing datum, man's connection with darkness and light. And all this finally led to us imagining this 20-acre site. In the center, we decided to build a wetland of varying depths. The grays, of course, the pathway networks that were created. And then we located the two houses, small cottages, and a small public pavilion. The squares on top are really the agricultural quadrants. The circles are the artistic quadrants that sit along this wetland. Very carefully, we looked at sight lines to make sure that when in the villas, when in the houses, when traversing the path, what was the site that one would constantly be so we funneled with? What was the visual porosity that many parts of the project would start creating? The idea of landscape was drawn almost like painting. So it was about denseness and darkness and sparseness. It was about color. It was about joyousness. And we kept on drawing these ideas before we even got down to the idea of whether it was going to be trees or shrubs or grasses or whatever else. And then gradually, these ideas started falling into place. We started knowing where the trees would be and where the shrubs would be and where the edges would be. And then we started making models, physical models of the planting, and tested it for these many ideas of sight lines and porosity, and finally leading to a fairly complex planting plan using only native flora, a confidence that perhaps came out of that leaf fellowship, a confidence that came out of that plant material demanding its space in our world. Then we looked at all the various gardens, and for each of the gardens, we sort of imagined many different forms of it. So there was a maze garden, there was a mound garden, there was a cacti garden, and finally the master plan appeared. This work has been going on now for the last 12 months, and very slowly at the beginning of the last year, and now pace, of course, has picked up. And as you can see, just the joy of going to this site is something else. You can see here the lakes being excavated, them being lined, an aerial shot with the lake in the center, the construction of the houses that is beginning, these sort of squares at the bottom, which are the agricultural squares, the three circles, which I call the art circle. One is the maze, one is the open air theater, and the other is the cacti and the succulent garden. One more image of this garden with the mounds that are very sculpted, almost like they're land art. And even images of the work as it proceeds fill us with great excitement and joy every time we go there. But nonetheless, over a number of years, we presume and hope that this project will end up looking a little bit like this. Some images of the roads, of the temple leading up and the bridge before it. One of the houses on the edge of the water, the lake relationship, and the pathways between the quadrants. This is of a landscape of a house that we finished, landscape and house, both the architecture, that we finished just before COVID hit the world. Last March is when these clients finally moved into the house. We had been working on it for a couple of years before that. This is a piece of land, again, a large piece of land, where the client's father had been planting fruit trees for decades. So the site really had lots of orchards of various kinds, grasslands, agriculture, small pond. And again, just to begin to understand this context and not respond to it quickly, we did these beautiful drawings of the site, just mapping ideas of the drawing. So mapping trees, mapping the kind of weave that the planting of the trees starts creating, sometimes a rupture in the fabric, sometimes a dense knit, looking at the idea of the manner in which the sky revealed itself as you walked amidst these trees, looking at the idea of sound, and not just the sound of birds, but also the sound of crackling leaves, or the sound of just bee eaters, or the sound of different, different butterflies or dragonflies that hummed into these spaces. And then we also looked at the idea of smell in different seasons, and what is it that one could smell as you walked in different, what was this smell map of this entire land that could get created. And then the idea of litter, so when leaves fell down on the ground, did they create patterns? Were they fine? Were they coarse? Little things like this. And it really, I'm not so sure whether all this directly ever gets translated into design, or whether all this begins to condition your mind into trying to design in a certain way that seems correct for the spirit of the place, for the sense of the place, for an abstract manner in which you can begin to connect with the idea of the place. Having done all this, we started imagining different locations of where the house could get located, and finally decided to locate it in that little area where there was a little open space, but nonetheless, it was held by many lines of trees. It was also held by a very important line of a Eugenia Avenue, and we decided to bring that very strongly within the thinking of the home. So the axis of the Eugenia marked in the red, where the fields were, we decided to plant the garden for the owners. These owners are people who invite people from the work, from the factory, workers from the factory several times a year, and have a meal with them. So they required large sort of arenas, large grounds where they could do it. And we thought it was important to retain the memory of the farm and nonetheless start creating these cosmic gardens that sat in the farm. So you can begin to see sets of grids and these cosmic circles that are beginning to get created. The idea of the pond was reimagined. We did many, many, many drawings for the pond, imagined it finally as something that was a rectangular pond with an island that sat in the middle, and on two sides, on one side was the dining block, and the other side, the office, home office of the client. Finally, a hand-drawn sketch that shows the entire composition, the red line marking the axiality of the house and the avenue, and on either side, you can begin to see the guest houses. Images then. This is, of course, of the entrance area as you start approaching the house and entering the house. a pool court that is one of the first courts that you encounter as you enter the house, another image of the same. And then this water body with the home office and the dining block on the other side. It's a tranquil water body with many different kinds of lilies and lotuses planted almost in Monet-type circles that bloom at different times of the year. Some more images of that space. This one of the island in the middle that is used very often by the owners of this place now. The planting around the lake, around the pond, and this entire composition that then presents itself when you start looking at it from the top. In the foreground, you can see a maize garden, a scented maize garden, and you can see the manner in which the house has been sited, and it's nestled between different lines of trees, protecting and saving all the trees, but nonetheless welcoming them as if friends, as if family in the composition of this house. The maize garden from the top. There's a tree planted in the center. It's a Maduka latifolia. One day it will become a large, stately tree, long after all of us have gone. The avenue with these two guest houses on the other side, and the same avenue when you see it from the top, and you see this rush of the Green Canyon dissecting this space with these two buildings on the either side. This composition, when you start looking at it from the top, this whole cosmic arrangement with grids and this sort of cosmic garden. The full composition then, a bird's eye view from the house looking at this cosmic garden and the guest house, and its connection with the orchard, and finally its connection with a much larger sense of the landscape. The last project then is something that's still in the making. It will be realized, I guess, on the 16th or 17th of February. Until then, it will be in making. In India, weddings is a big thing. We've designed, so this is something that we had designed in 2000. It's a large wedding venue where people come and host the weddings of their sons or daughters. Several thousand people come for these weddings, and they're really a place for pomp and glitter and a lot of show. This is another one that we designed, which is the size of the football ground. And in the night when it's lit, there are these moons that are hanging in this space. But the COVID, of course, has put an end to all this, and has also begun to ask ourselves, what is this idea of celebration? What is this idea of family? What is this idea of bonding? So just about 4 months back, I think, in October, middle October, a young couple got in touch with us and asked whether we could help them in doing the preparations for their wedding. We were not sure what that really meant, but we went to a piece of land that the father owned. It was a barren piece of land with a bunch of trees at the end of that piece of land. And they wanted to use this piece of land as a venue for their wedding and wanted us to create a venue. There was, of course, very little time because there was, the winters are not as harsh as the winters there, but nonetheless, things don't grow. And we just had about 2.5, 3 months to begin to imagine the space. This led us to drawing several options very quickly. We picked up the one on the right. The smaller circle is the place where the wedding will actually happen. The bigger circle is where the meals will be served. And of course, the rest of them are pathways, some connecting from the entrance, some connecting to the space where the cooking will happen, some connecting to the place which are the bride and the bridegroom's room for the day. An image where the first line out was done just about 2.5 months back. And we planted this with wild grasses, with crop, with seasonal flowers, hoping and praying that something would happen, a miracle would happen in time for the wedding. Images of the same place taken about 15 days back, which is really a month and a half after planting. And with each passing day, it begins to express itself better and better and better. And here you can begin to see the main venue. The seasonal flowers are beginning to show up. You can see, ladies in the center working very painstakingly, leveling the ground, creating a stage out of mud. We were extremely gratified to see all this happening, but our joy really knew no bounds. We were touched when we received an invitation for this wedding. And the invitation was done by Vishwa, the bride, and Dishit, the bridegroom, and they decided to paint this venue and use that as an idea of their wedding invitation. This was extremely touching. In a time when the world countered the idea of death, of loss, in a time when the idea of life itself was being questioned, in a time when new beginnings was something that we had stopped to imagine. A young couple decided to walk on a barren piece of land and imagine that a world could get created just in the time that they would get married. If there is poetry in this world, if there is something that is symbolic in this world, I cannot imagine what could be more symbolic than this. In the last time that we were there were also some other projects that we had shown, some of them that need some recounting today only because they fit in this subset of the projects that we've talked about. There was a fort, a landscape for a fort in a desert land. And picture on the left, for example, is of a fountain where the water goes down in the womb of the fountain. And it really was a tribute to the way women in feudal cultures are treated, where they absorb all the pain and internalize the pain. There were similar narratives told all over in different courts of this palace, or this house and garden, which we call for the longest time the bridge house, simply because it started with the idea of tame nature, as the image on the left hand shows, very organized, topiary, tame nature, and then it enters the house and sort of exits the house and rides the cusp of nature. So on one side sits tame nature, and the other side sits wild nature, and enters the house again and descends back into wild nature. The entire idea of that living being a stage to look at the drama of nature in its glory, in its different seasons. And this one project that we'd shown, which was a farmhouse, which was a weekend house, which really talked about the idea of fractals, of discontinuities, that you could be living in life with two completely contradicting ideas, just separated by a thin wall. That life was not about a continuous narrative, that life was about many emotions being thrown at us all the time, and our ability to be able to deal with these emotions, irrespective of what phase of life we are going through. And finally, a project that in the office we continue to believe is something that we will always look up to. This is something that was done by my father. He looked at a 200-acre basalt quarry, completely devastated. And in a hot summer, and the Indian summers can be hot, in a hot Indian summer, imagine that he could convert this into a forest. And 8 years later, the images on the right, this forest continues to bloom, it continues to thrive, and it continues to become a place of great importance for the people to whom it belongs to. So finally, in leaving, I have to say a few things, that these projects to us have taken greater significance because they've taken on ideas that are larger than themselves, because they've become tools to guide conversations. They've talked about abstract pursuits, and they've presented new relationships with varying ideas of nature. It seems clear to me that all of us will have to fight harder to demonstrate the values that we hold dear to ourselves. Only then will we be equipped to find meaning in the work that we do, to examine it, to deconstruct it, and then to build this world again. So finally, in parting, let me leave you with a verse. In blackest darkness, eyes will attune, forgotten senses will take hold, shadows will become creatures, and we will traverse. The inanimate will whisper, a kinship will be formed. Remember them. Every sense that came alive, every thought that crossed your mind, sift, collect, store, and release in your consciousness so that it courses through your blood, so that you never forget, and let it guide you in a world that has changed forever. Thank you very much.